Reach into your pocket, the thin rectangle of plastic you carry without a second thought, the one that lets you walk into almost any store in America and leave with a television, a car, even a diamond ring, all on a simple promise to pay later, did not exist for most of this country's history. For generations, there was no credit card, no swipe, no tap, no invisible line of borrowed money waiting in your wallet for the moment you wanted something you could not yet afford. And yet Americans were buying things that cost far more than they had, pianos that filled a front room with music, sewing machines that could earn a family its living, iceboxes, farm equipment, parlor furniture, automobiles, and eventually the very homes in which they raised their children. By the 1920s, a brand new automobile could cost more than many families earned in months of hard work, and still, somehow, they were finding ways to drive them off the lot. So how did they do it? How did a factory worker earning a few dollars a day drive home a machine that cost more than he made in months? How did a young couple with almost nothing to their name furnish an entire household they could not possibly pay for all at once? Before you hear the answer, ask yourself something simple. Do you believe people should be able to own something today and pay for it slowly over time? Or should they wait until every last dollar is saved? Hold on to your answer, because the America that faced that same question solved it in a way almost no one remembers today. The easy assumption is that they simply saved, that earlier generations were patient, disciplined people who dropped coins into a jar until it was full, then walked into a store with cash in hand and bought what they needed outright. It is a comforting picture of a thriftier, simpler past. It is also almost entirely wrong, because the truth is stranger and far more human. Long before the first credit card was ever printed, ordinary Americans were already living on borrowed money. They were buying now and paying later on a scale that would astonish us today. The debt stretched everywhere, through crowded immigrant cities, across quiet farmland, into the smallest towns at the end of the longest dirt roads. Nearly every family at some point owed money to someone for something they could not yet afford. But it did not look like the debt we know. There were no interest rates printed on glossy monthly statements, no toll-free numbers to call, no vast national companies quietly recording every purchase a person ever made. The entire system ran on something far older and far more fragile than a bank ever was. It ran on trust. Not the cold, abstract trust of a corporation, but the personal, face-to-face trust between two human beings who actually knew each other. A shopkeeper who knew your name and your father's name before you. Who knew whether your word was good, whether you paid what you promised, whether the harvest had come in that year or failed. In a world without plastic, your ability to buy the things you needed came down almost entirely to what one person believed about your character. This was a world where credit was not a number on a screen, it was a reputation, built slowly and lost quickly. And that single difference shaped everything: how people lived, how they were judged by their neighbors, and how far they would go to protect a good name that could not easily be won back. Yet this quiet, deeply personal system carried an astonishing weight. It financed the machines that fed families and the tools that built trades. It stretched across a growing, restless nation of people who all seemed to want more than they could presently afford. Millions who owned almost nothing were quietly building entire lives on the strength of a promise, and somehow, against all logic, for decades, it held. How was that even possible? Who kept the records? What happened to a family when they finally could not pay? And why would anyone hand over something valuable to a near stranger armed with nothing but a promise and a handshake? The answers lead into a forgotten America, one preserved inside old store ledgers, in yellowed newspaper advertisements, in installment contracts signed in slow, careful handwriting. An America where owning anything of real value demanded creativity, patience, and above all, the willingness to be trusted by someone who could just as easily say no. Hi, viewers. Would you rather own something today and pay for it little by little, or wait until you could pay for it completely? Share your answer in the comments. It may reveal more about you than you expect. Because the solution that carried millions of American families through their entire lives did not come from a bank. It did not come from Wall Street, and it did not come from any politician in Washington. It came from somewhere far more ordinary, and it was written down, line by patient line, in a plain paper book kept behind the counter of the local store. What was recorded in those pages, and what that humble system would eventually grow into, was about to change the way an entire nation lived, spent, and dreamed forever. Step into that store for a moment. Picture the smell of it. Coffee, kerosene, cured meat, sawdust on the floor. Behind the counter sits the most powerful object in the whole town. Not the cash register, the book. A thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages soft from handling, filled with columns of names and numbers written in fading ink. Every family in the county has a page, and on that page is written the truth about who they are. This was the real financial system of early America. Not banks, not cash. Credit, extended one handshake at a time, recorded one line at a time, by a man who knew everyone he lent to. A farmer would come in through the long months between planting and harvest, when there was no money at all, and he would take what his family needed: flour, seed, cloth, nails, a new axe head, perhaps a bolt of calico for a daughter's dress. The storekeeper wrote it all down. Nothing changed hands but goods and trust. Then, when the crops came in and were sold, the farmer would return with cash, and together they would settle the book. A whole year of a family's survival, balanced in a single afternoon. It worked, because the storekeeper knew things no bank could ever know. He knew whether a man was honest. He knew if the family was hard-working or careless. He knew whether last year's debt had been paid, and whether the son could be trusted like the father. Your creditworthiness was not a number. It was your reputation, and everyone in town could read it in the way the storekeeper treated you. But this intimate system had a shadow side, and it was not gentle. If the storekeeper decided you were a risk, you were finished. There was no appeal, no second opinion. A widow, a newcomer, a family that had fallen on hard times through no fault of their own, they could find every door in town quietly closed. And for millions of Americans, the system was rigged from the very start. Black families in the South, especially sharecroppers, often found themselves bound to a single plantation store, forced to buy on credit at inflated prices, the debt engineered through the cropland system so that it could never truly be paid off. What looked like credit was, for them, a cage, a way to keep a family tied to the land, working to settle a balance that only ever grew. Hi, viewers. Would you feel comfortable if the only way to buy what your family needed was to convince one man that you were trustworthy? Let us know in the comments. For the poor in the growing cities, the situation was often worse. Banks would not touch them. A bank in the 19th century existed to serve merchants and the wealthy, not a factory worker who needed $20 to get through a hard winter. So the working poor turned to the only lenders who would have them, the pawn shops, and worse, the loan sharks. These men lent small sums at monstrous rates, sometimes hundreds of % a year, and enforced repayment through threats and public humiliation. It was a quiet epidemic in every American city. Reformers spent decades fighting it, eventually helping to pass new laws that finally allowed honest, regulated small loan companies to operate in the open. Respectable-sounding firms with names like Household Finance and Beneficial rose up precisely to drag borrowing out of the shadows and offer the working man an alternative to the shark. A landmark model law, drafted in 1916 by reformers who had studied the misery of the loan shark trade for years, finally set legal interest limits and licensing rules for small lenders across state after state, and the men who wrote it did not see their work as a way of encouraging debt. They saw it as a rescue, a way for a hard-working family that saved and borrowed wisely to climb toward independence, instead of being quietly devoured by the very system meant to help them. And yet, even in this hard world, a strange and powerful idea was quietly taking root, the idea that would eventually change everything. It began, of all places, with a sewing machine. In the 1850s, a machine that could sew was a marvel. It could transform a woman's labor, cut the endless hours of hand-stitching, even earn a family real money taking in piecework. But it cost around $125, a staggering sum, more than many families earned in months. Almost no one could pay that in cash. And so the machines sat in showrooms, admired and unbought. Then, in 1856, a lawyer named Edward Clark, the business mind behind the Singer sewing machine company, tried something no major American company had ever done. He let people take the machine home for a few dollars down and pay off the rest a few dollars at a time, week after week, until it was theirs. He called it the hire purchase plan. We would call it buying on installment. It was, quite simply, the birth of modern consumer credit in America. And here is the strange part. It worked almost too well. Singer's sales nearly tripled in a single year. The company sent agents door to door, not only to demonstrate the machines, but to collect those weekly payments in person, building a nationwide web of salesmen who doubled as debt collectors. But observers noticed something curious about human nature in the process. People who could have paid the full price in cash often chose the installment plan instead, happily paying more in the end, in small weekly pieces, rather than parting with a large sum all at once. A magazine of the day marveled at it. Customers would rather owe $100 slowly than spend $50 at once. The pain of buying, spread thin across the months, barely seemed to hurt at all. That quiet discovery, that people will gladly go into debt if the debt is small enough each week, was a seed. For decades it grew slowly, in the background of American life. Sewing machines, pianos and parlor organs, furniture, encyclopedias sold door to door by traveling men with sample cases, and the great mail-order catalogs of Sears and Montgomery Ward, thick as bricks, arriving in farmhouses across the country, like a window into a world of things a family could almost afford. To rural America, those catalogs were known simply as the wish books. Singer had discovered another trick along the way. It would take a customer's worn-out old machine as a trade, credit its value against a shiny new one, and start the whole cycle of weekly payments over again. The lesson rippled outward through American selling. Keep the customer always owning, always owing, always reaching for the next thing before the last one was paid off. For a long time, it stayed manageable. A modest, patchwork web of trust and small payments, holding a nation of strivers just above their means. But something was coming down those same dirt roads. Something that cost more than a sewing machine, more than a piano, more than almost anything an ordinary family had ever dreamed of owning. Something that would push this fragile, personal system past its breaking point and force America to decide, once and for all, what it truly believed about debt. It had 4 wheels, and it was about to change everything. The automobile arrived like a thunderclap. At first it was a rich man's toy, a plaything for the wealthy who paid cash for the fun of it. But then Henry Ford did something revolutionary. He built cars on a moving assembly line, cheap enough and fast enough to put millions of them within reach of ordinary people. Suddenly the American worker could imagine owning a car, could picture his own family piled in, driving out past the edge of town on a Sunday afternoon. There was just one problem. Even a cheap, mass-produced car still cost more money than most families would see in many months of labor. You could build a car an ordinary person could afford to own, but not one they could afford to buy. Not all at once, not in cash. The old system had no answer for this. No storekeeper's ledger could carry a debt that large. No bank would lend a factory worker that kind of money to buy a machine that would lose value the moment he drove it away. The car was the future, gleaming in the showroom window, and almost no one could pay for it. The solution came in 1919, and it did not come from a bank or a politician. It came from inside General Motors. There had been small, scattered attempts to finance cars before. A few daring firms had tested the idea in the years just prior. But General Motors did it at a scale no one had dared. Led by financial minds including John J. Raskob and backed by the rising executive Alfred Sloan, the company created something with a dull and forgettable name that would quietly reshape American life: the General Motors Acceptance Corporation. The idea behind it was deceptively simple and utterly transformative. General Motors would no longer just sell you a car, it would lend you the money to buy the car. You put down around a third of the price, drove the automobile home that very day, and paid off the rest in monthly installments over the coming year, plus a carrying charge, the interest, folded quietly into each payment. For the first time, a giant corporation was not just financing the product, it was financing the customer. The effect was explosive. Americans, who a generation earlier had whispered about debt as a moral failing, now lined up to sign contracts and drive away in machines they did not yet own. The old shame was dissolving, replaced by a thrilling new promise: buy now, pay later. Own it today. Worry about the cost tomorrow. Picture the scene playing out in 1,000 small-town showrooms. A young couple stands before a gleaming automobile they have no business affording. The salesman does not ask them for the full price. He asks a gentler question: how much can you manage each month? He does the arithmetic on a notepad, turns it around, and suddenly the impossible has a number attached to it, a number small enough to say yes to. They sign. They drive away that same afternoon, the whole family leaning out the windows, and for the first time in their lives they own something magnificent that is not yet truly theirs. Multiply that single moment by millions, and you have the engine of an entire new economy and the quiet remaking of the American conscience. But not everyone celebrated, and the fiercest critic was the very man who had put America on wheels in the first place. Henry Ford was disgusted. To him, buying on credit was close to a sin, reckless, undignified, a betrayal of the thrift that had built the country. He refused, at first, to play the game. Instead, Ford offered his customers an old-fashioned alternative: bring $5 or $10 a week to your local dealer, let it sit in an account, and when you had saved the full amount, only then could you drive your car home. It was layaway. Save first, buy second. The moral path. And America rejected it. Given the choice between saving up for a car and driving one home immediately on borrowed money, the public overwhelmingly chose the debt. By 1930, roughly 3 out of every 4 automobiles in America were bought on time. Ford, the great industrialist who believed he understood the American soul better than anyone, had misjudged it completely. The country did not want to wait, it never really had, and in the end, even Ford surrendered, setting up his own financing arm to stop losing customers to General Motors. And for all the moralists thundering, the new system proved astonishingly sturdy. Through the roaring boom, the losses on all those millions of car loans amounted to a tiny fraction of a single percent. Proof, its defenders insisted, that ordinary Americans were not the reckless spendthrifts the critics imagined, but careful, prideful people who paid what they owed. Even later, when the Depression struck and the whole economy buckled, the share of borrowers who defaulted on their automobile payments barely rose at all. It turned out people would give up almost anything before they surrendered the car in the driveway. And the automobile was only the beginning. Once Americans grew comfortable with monthly payments, that comfort spread to everything: refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, radios that brought voices and music into the parlor for the first time, furniture, pianos, jewelry. By 1930, most of the durable goods filling American homes were bought not with cash, but with credit stretched across the months to come. A new gospel was preached from every advertisement: the gospel of consumption. Owning things was no longer a reward earned after years of saving. It was a right available now to anyone willing to sign on the line. But underneath the shine, uneasy voices were rising. In the small city of Muncie, Indiana, 2 sociologists named Robert and Helen Lind studied ordinary American life up close, and they watched with worry as the old habit of careful saving came undone. Some families, they noted, were even mortgaging their homes to buy an automobile. A former Ford executive turned United States Senator condemned the whole installment craze as inflation of the most dangerous kind, a nation pledging its future earnings for luxuries it did not need, while children went without. Labor newspapers warned that money spent on payments was money stolen from food and clothing. Debt, the critics warned, was not freedom. It was a trap dressed up as prosperity. And then, in October of 1929, the trap seemed to snap shut. The stock market collapsed. The Great Depression descended like a long gray winter that would not end. Factories fell silent. Wages vanished. Unemployment climbed to heights no one had imagined possible. And all across America, the bills came due for a decade of buying on time. Families who had signed cheerful contracts in the boom now watched, helpless, as the repossession men came to the door to take back the car, the furniture, the radio, carrying away the proud symbols of a prosperity that had turned out to be borrowed. What credit had given so easily, it now took away. In the bitterness that followed, many Americans told themselves a comforting story, that the country had strayed from its thrifty roots, that their grandparents had lived free of debt, paying cash and owing no one, and that this reckless new appetite for credit was a modern disease that had brought the disaster down upon them. But that story was a myth, and here lies the truth most people never learn. There never was a golden age of thrift. America was never a cash-only paradise. From the farmer's page in the storekeeper's ledger, to the widow at the pawn shop counter, to the family paying off a sewing machine a single dollar at a time, Americans had always lived on borrowed money. Debt was not a modern corruption of some purer past. It had always been there, not merely as a weakness or an indulgence, but as a strategy for survival, a tool that ordinary people used to build lives they could not otherwise have afforded. It simply pulled it out of the shadows and put it on display in a showroom window. Chastened by the Depression, the country reached for a gentler, guiltier form of credit. Layaway, the very plan Henry Ford had championed, surged in popularity. Set the item aside at the store, pay it off slowly over the weeks, and take it home only when it was fully yours. No debt, no interest, no repossession, no shame. It felt like a return to virtue, a way to still want things without the danger of owing. America had looked into the abyss of easy credit and recoiled. It swore it had learned its lesson. And then, on a single day in 1958, a bank in California quietly dropped 60,000 live, ready-to-use credit cards into the mailboxes of people who had never asked for them, and lit the fuse on the world we live in now. But that explosion was decades in the making, built quietly from a series of small, strange inventions. The first appeared in 1928, when a company began issuing something called the Charga plate. It was a small rectangle of sheet metal, about the size of a soldier's dog tag, embossed with a customer's name, city, and state. When you made a purchase, a clerk laid the little plate into a machine, pressed it against a paper slip with an inked ribbon, and stamped your identity onto the record of the sale. Department stores handed them out to their best regular customers, and for the first time, buying on credit had a physical object, a thing you carried in your purse or pocket, a token of trust you could hold in your hand. But the Charga plate had a hard limit. It only worked inside the store that issued it. Your plate from one shop was worthless in another. Each business was its own little island of credit, sealed off from all the rest. Some stores did not even let customers keep their plates, storing them in a file behind the counter and pulling them out only when that customer came to shop. Other experiments pushed at the edges of the idea. In the 1930s, the airlines began offering travel cards that let trusted passengers book flights and settle up later. In 1946, a banker in Brooklyn named John Biggins launched a program called Charge It, which let people charge purchases at local shops to their account at his bank, but only within a tiny radius of a couple of city blocks, because the merchants had to walk their sales slips back to the bank. Each of these was a fragment of the future. None of them was the whole. The dream that slowly formed was of a single card that could work everywhere, a universal key to credit itself. The breakthrough, as legend has it, came from an embarrassment. In 1949, a New York businessman named Frank McNamara was dining out with clients when he reached for his wallet and realized, to his horror, that he had left it behind. Whether the story is entirely true or polished smooth by decades of retelling, the idea it produced was real. Together with his partner Ralph Schneider, McNamara launched the Diners Club card in 1950. At first it was a humble thing, printed on cardboard, honored at just 27 restaurants in New York City, carried by a couple hundred of the founder's friends and associates. Diners would pay with the card, and the club would settle with the restaurant, take a small cut, and bill the customer at the end of the month. It was small, but the concept was enormous. For the first time, a card issued by a neutral third party, not a store, not a single merchant, was accepted at many different businesses, and it caught fire. By the end of that very first year, the club counted some 20,000 members. Within a couple more, tens of thousands more had signed on. An annual fee was charged simply for the privilege of carrying it, and the humble cardboard gave way to plastic. The universal card had been born, and soon rivals like American Express and Carte Blanche rushed in behind it. But Diners Club still demanded the entire balance be paid in full every single month. The final, fateful piece was still missing, and it fell to Bank of America to add it. On September the 18th, 1958, in the city of Fresno, California, the bank ran an experiment so audacious it seems almost insane in hindsight. It chose Fresno on purpose, a modest city where nearly half the residents already banked with them, and where a quiet failure could be buried without much national attention. And then it mailed out 60,000 fully active credit cards to residents who had never requested them. Each one carried a ready line of credit, hundreds of dollars, waiting to be spent by people who had done nothing to earn it but open an envelope. This was the true innovation, and it had two parts. First, the mass mailing solved the oldest problem in the business, the one that had strangled every earlier attempt. No merchant wanted to accept a card that no customers carried. No customer wanted a card that no merchant honored. By flooding an entire city with cards overnight, Bank of America shattered that deadlock in a single stroke, creating an instant army of cardholders that local shops could not afford to ignore. And second, unlike Diners Club, this card let you carry your balance from 1 month into the next, paying only a portion of what you owed and letting interest accumulate on the rest. It was revolving credit, a debt designed to roll forward, potentially forever. Bank of America held one more advantage that few rivals could match. It had invested early and heavily in the enormous mainframe computers and telephone networks needed to track hundreds of thousands of accounts at once, tallying every purchase and payment automatically. Without those machines, the sheer flood of transactions would have buried any bank that tried it. The credit card was never only a financial idea, it was a technological one, and it arrived at the precise moment the technology existed to make it possible. The launch was chaos. Fraud erupted. Cards were stolen from mailboxes and used before anyone noticed. Delinquency soared past 20% as people happily spent money they had no ability to repay. Critics called it a reckless disaster, and in the short term, it very nearly was. But it worked. Within 10 months, more than 1 million of these cards had spread across California. The idea proved unstoppable. Bank of America's card would eventually be licensed to banks across the nation and around the world, and in time it took on a new name you carry today, Visa. A rival alliance of banks rose to challenge it in the 1960s and became MasterCard. The system spread so aggressively, mailing unsolicited live cards to millions of unsuspecting Americans, that Congress finally stepped in and made it illegal to send an active credit card to anyone who had never asked for one. The winners were clear: the banks and the great national retailers who could now sell to anyone with a piece of plastic in their pocket. But there was a quiet loser too. The corner storekeeper with his leather ledger, the man whose personal knowledge of his neighbors had been the beating heart of American credit for a century, was now obsolete. His judgment was no longer needed, or even wanted. A bank 1,000 miles away, that had never met you and never would now decide what you could and could not buy. And that raised a question the entire system now depended on. If a distant bank was going to hand credit to millions of strangers it had never met, how, exactly, would it decide whom to trust? The answer is the true legacy of this story, and it is watching you right now. To lend to strangers, the banks needed to replace the one thing the old storekeeper had that they lacked: knowledge. They needed to know about people they had never met, everything the storekeeper had once known about his own neighbors. Were you honest? Did you pay your debts? Had you ever run out on a bill? Could you be trusted? So they turned to an industry that had been quietly building the answer for generations. The idea of tracking a person's reputation for profit was not new. As far back as 1841, a merchant named Louis Tappan founded an agency to collect reports on the trustworthiness of businessmen across the country, the ancestor of the great business credit firms. But the machine that would come to rule ordinary lives began in Atlanta in 1899, when two brothers, Cador and Guy Wolford, founded the Retail Credit Company. Their product was disarmingly simple. They compiled the payment histories and reputations of ordinary people into books, and sold those books to merchants who wanted to know, before extending a dime of credit, exactly who deserved it. It grew and grew and grew. By the 1920s, it had offices spread across the United States and Canada. By the 1960s, it held files on many millions of Americans. And what those files contained went far beyond whether you paid your bills on time. Investigators fanned out to gather rumors and intimate details about people's private lives, their marriages and their troubles, their jobs, their childhoods, their drinking, even their political opinions and personal relationships. It was a vast, private surveillance operation, assembled quietly over decades, and sold to very nearly anyone willing to pay for a look. When the public finally grasped the scale of it, the outrage was immense. A Columbia professor and other critics exposed how a citizen's entire life was being cataloged, first in filing cabinets, then in computers, with no way for that citizen to see the file, correct its errors, or even know it existed. In 1970, Congress responded with the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the first law giving Americans the right to see and challenge what these companies knew about them. The Retail Credit Company, its name now stained by the scandal, quietly rebranded itself. Today you know it as Equifax, one of the 3 great bureaus that still hold a detailed file on nearly every adult in the country. And then came the final transformation, the moment your reputation became a number. For most of history, trust was a judgment, a storekeeper's feeling, a banker's opinion, a human being weighing another human being. But an engineer named Bill Fair and a mathematician named Earl Isaac believed that trust could be calculated. They founded their company in the 1950s, convinced that a person's likelihood of repaying could be reduced to statistics. And in 1989, working with the credit bureaus, they gave the world the modern credit score, a single 3-digit number, somewhere between 300 and 850, that claims to capture your entire financial character, your worth as a borrower distilled into math. And within just a few years, the great institutions that stood behind most of the nation's home loans began demanding that number on nearly every mortgage application. Almost overnight, a score dreamed up by 2 men in a California office became a gatekeeper standing between millions of American families and the front doors of the houses they hoped to call their own. That number now shapes your life in ways the old storekeeper never could. It decides whether you can buy a home and how much that home will cost you over 30 years of payments. It can determine the car you drive, the apartment you are allowed to rent, the interest you pay on everything, and sometimes even the job you are offered. A century ago, your reputation lived in the memory of a man who knew your name and could choose to forgive you when times turned hard. Today it lives in a database that never forgets, feels nothing, and answers to no one you will ever meet. This is the great, hidden irony of the story. We tend to believe the credit card set us free, that plastic gave us the power to buy anything, anytime, anywhere, on our own terms. But the card did not set us free. It delivered us into a system that watches every purchase, records every debt, scores every choice, and remembers it all for years on end. The founders of American Credit began with a book behind the counter, known only to one small town. We ended with a permanent file we cannot see and a number we cannot escape. Americans never lacked credit before the credit card. They lacked the number. They had something we have quietly lost, a system where trust was human, personal, imperfect, and, when it mattered most, capable of mercy. We traded the storekeeper who knew our name for an algorithm that only knows our score. The man behind the counter could look you in the eye and remember the year your crop failed. The number remembers only that you were late, and whether that was progress or a quiet kind of surrender is a question worth sitting with long after this story ends. So here is the real question this forgotten history leaves behind. Would you rather live in a world where your ability to buy depended on one person's memory of your character, flawed and biased but human, or in ours, where it depends on a permanent number calculated by a machine that has never met you? Which of those 2 worlds was truly free? Tell us what you think in the comments. The answer says a great deal about the world we have chosen to build. Because the story of how Americans bought things is really the story of how Americans learned to trust strangers, and of what, exactly, we surrendered in order to do it. And this is far from the strangest chapter in America's hidden financial past, because there was once a time, not so very long ago, when the dollars in a person's pocket might turn worthless the moment they crossed a county line. An era when America had no single national currency at all, but thousands of different kinds of paper money, printed by thousands of separate private banks, each promising a value that no one could truly verify. Some of it was good as gold, much of it was outright fraud. And every merchant kept a thick catalog on the counter just to tell the real money from the counterfeit. How did an entire nation buy, sell, and survive when nobody could agree on what a dollar was even worth? That story is coming next, and once you understand it, you will never look at the cash in your wallet the same way again.